Okay, so good evening and thank you so much for joining us. I continue to believe that this is really less about the SDI in particular and more about spreading a new school of thought for all high school and college debate programs, where there are more accessible ways to get free instruction outside the normal brick and mortar confines of a summer debate camp. As I said in some of the emails that I've sent out to students that are involved, why should summer instruction be limited to the summer? The topics continue to evolve, the curiosity continues to grow, and there's a real opportunity to provide free and open access to all. So if you like what we are doing, share it with younger peers on your own debate program. And over time, I really do believe that we're on the ground floor of something that is going to grow. If you take a look at the notes that I posted, I'm not going to be the kind of instructor that parrots back at you the glossary section. But one thing that I think arises a lot with the security critique in particular is a bunch of vocab that assumes that all of you have gone to college and majored in public policy or international relations. So I have a really unusual task at hand for me tonight, because one of my goals is to help you learn how to speak that language, because I do think that that language will impress judges. But I'm sort of limiting myself to be done by 9 p.m. Eastern time. And so I don't want to kind of turn this into just repeating high-tech terminology and hoping that you grasp it. So that's sort of the purpose of the glossary as it presently exists. A few kind of clarification roadmap style notes before I kind of jump into the blood and guts of tonight's discussion. First of all, I really do want to work at different means on how to present this new form of sort of non-summer instruction. And I think that starts with you all posing questions on the sidebar. I might see if it's on the sidebar. Tyler will definitely see it if it's on the sidebar. And feel free to sort of interrupt what I'm doing, because I don't consider this to be a rigid lecture in a classic sense. For those of you that are interested in different parts of this, I plan to devote the first section to discussing security, and I'm hoping that that section will last until about 8:40 Eastern time. And then I'm hoping to devote the last 15 to 20 minutes to a discussion of the new topic. If you want to steer that in a different direction, that's fine. I could see some graduating seniors not caring at all about the 2020-21 criminal justice reform topic. But I do think that that is something that we obviously should discuss given its recent announcement in the last week or so. So without much further ado, let me jump into the section of the notes which says opening section. And I guess I'm going to get us all on the same page under section 2.0, in that the security critique means different things to different people. And I want to kind of lead with the different ways in which the security critique exists. Version 1.0, as I list that, is sort of the crudest version of the security critique. Think of yourself at the beginning of your high school career. You hear that your opponent has run a 1AC, which is talking about war or an outbreak of insecurity somewhere on the planet. And you have decided to say that war impacts are not something that we should discuss. They're unlikely, that they tend to be inaccurate, that they tend to buy into violent assumptions about the countries or players that are involved. And that, I think, is the most basic logic behind the security critique. The second version of the security critique has grown, at least in college, with non-traditional teams, where there's an awful lot of non-traditional debating going on in college. And here, teams that are discussing identity sort of go down a different pathway. They argue some of the same premises, that war and interstate conflict is not all that likely, but they tend to go a step further and try to pigeonhole the affirmative into sort of saying that they're talking about something that's highly hypothetical, that is only really talked about in wonky college courses or in the corners of the Pentagon, and that in reality, these events are nowhere near as likely as daily structural violence. And usually there's a plot twist associated with it that says that daily structural violence is more likely to be something that would kill or harm people, or even to be the underlying cause of international conflict. Kind of famous talking point that I used to hear when I would watch more of these debates is that every war is ultimately a race war or a war of otherization. And there is some truth to that, that it's sort of possible to characterize every interstate conflict or security situation as an animosity that exists in the realm of stereotyping somebody else as being radically different from your country or your side of the equation. Usually in both version 1.0 and version 2.0, there's an effort by the negative to argue that the affirmative team that's talking about war is similar to people in the Pentagon or similar to people that engage in war planning, and that there's a tendency amongst those people to be overly worried about these events, that there's a tendency to prepare for way too many contingencies, that there's a tendency to assume the world is a much more violent or hostile place than someone who isn't located in the corners of the Pentagon. And those stereotypes might be true, they might not be true, but it's kind of important to consider how you might want to argue that what you're defending, if you're affirmative, differs from everything that's going on under every understanding of what it means to be the Pentagon. The one that I'm going to talk about the most, and the one that I think is the greatest utility to discuss because it would help answer versions 1 and versions 2, is the classic international relations critique. The basic thesis of this international relations critique, or IR critique, is explained in the glossary. But I suspect if you understand this, you'll do well at defeating all versions of the security critique. And I'll start by discussing epistemology. Apologies to those of you that have heard me use this analogy before, but I think it's a good one and it's an interesting way to start, and it might connect me with each of you in a slightly different way. So epistemology is the study of knowledge and how we come to understand what we understand. And the international relations critique often argues that the very fundamental assumptions of what one would learn in school about international relations are wrong. That if Tyler Thurr goes to Michigan State University, which he did, and he majors in political science, which he did, and he takes a course about international conflict, which he did, that what is being taught at Michigan State University is the same as what's being taught in a lot of the quote unquote Western world. And all of those assumptions create a groupthink about how war happens, why it happens, and that all of those assumptions are wrong. To explain the concept of epistemology, let me use my favorite analogy. Many of you might know that I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. The 4-year-old is a young boy, and the 2-year-old is a young girl named Robin, and Robin was born with a medical condition where she only has one ear. It's an unusual medical condition, and I don't bring it up to engender sympathy for me or for her or for whatever, but it does frame the analogy. So Kirby had only really ever seen one baby come to his house. So one day when Kirby and Robin were just a little bit older, and Kirby was old enough to talk, Kirby had a different friend bring over a baby brother. Carly, my colleague, brought over her newborn son. And it had never dawned on us before, but Kirby walked over and he just looked a whole bunch at the baby. He looked at Carly's baby and he looked at us and he said, "This baby has 2 ears." And he was astonished that a baby would have 2 ears, because he had always engaged in a study of knowledge where every baby that he had ever seen didn't arrive with 2 ears. And it had never dawned on him as a little guy that situation might not change for Robin, or that that's just kind of atypical. And so this sort of frames the idea of epistemology. If everything that we learn in college or however we gain knowledge is fundamentally wrong. Everyone can believe it and buy into it, but it's based on their limited set of exposures and not a broader set of opportunities and a broader set of kind of ideas that one encounters. So if Kirby had seen a lot of babies, which he now has, he might have had a different understanding of the situation at hand. So the epistemology critique is fundamentally what is going on with the IR critique of security. And it argues that some of the very, very basic premises of how war starts are wrong. So a negative would be saying, yes, you've read a card and your card says that a war will happen, and it's all part of a deep misunderstanding of how these things occur in the first place. So let's unpack what that deeper understanding is and start to use some terminologies that would come up, I think, if you were debating a team that was defending the security critique in its greatest level of detail. There are different schools of thought as to why war happens. And one of the primary schools of thought that gets critiqued is the realist school of thought. You can go back to the glossary section under realists, and you can kind of read what the realists write. But the definition of the realists is pretty basic. And it basically says that there are no one super entity that controls the United States, Russia, or any other nation state. And so because there's not one overarching power structure, power is sort of figured out by the players. To go back to a crude analogy, there's no real teacher in the preschool of international relations. And so everyone is sort of amidst the Lord of the Flies and is trying to kind of figure out how to gain power and to control the situation. The realists believe that that notion of anarchy, the fact that there is not a super organizing entity, means that states will inevitably fight one another for power, and that it becomes a little bit of survival of the fittest that makes conflict very, very likely. There are other premises of the realist thesis that are kind of outlined. Amongst the realists, there is a fundamental difference between the offensive realists and the defensive realists. These are not the only two schools of thought. These are not the only two ways to explain war, but they are amongst the most criticized reasons why your war arguments may be inaccurate. So under the section offense versus defensive realism, I'm going to start with way number one, which is what is offensive realism? And before I give you a definition that you can jot down, save, and pass on to your peers, let me say that I do think a lot of people that are running a security critique or answering your impact arguments in a policy debate are usually assuming that your author is writing from the perspective of the offensive realists. The offensive realists argue, you might want to jot this down, first, that there is no superstructure and that nothing stops anarchy or sort of a Lord of the Flies situation where there is no governing entity between nations. And because of that, force and the use of force tends to become inevitable. And then they argue that the threat or the perception of that threat makes aggression logical and feeds into one of the premises of the realists, which is that states, and by states I don't mean Wyoming, but I mean like China, the United States, etc., will act in their own interest, and their own interest lends towards aggression. The defensive realists are commonly misunderstood to be totally different than the offensive realists. They actually agree on a lot of basic premises. The defensive realists, under way number two, agree that there is no overarching structure, that there is no super entity, and that states will act in their own logical interests. But they disagree with the offensive realists, and they argue that instead, the inevitable outcome is not conflict and the Lord of the Flies, but that a lot of governments, a lot of nations would choose to not go into war because it would disrupt the way that things presently exist. It would disrupt global power dynamics. And because they do act in their own best interests, sometimes their best interest does not inevitably lend towards aggression. And so the defensive realists are not peaceniks. They're not of the mindset that war never happens. That's a really bad place to put yourself if you're running a critique, because wars have obviously happened many times throughout human history. But they instead argue that war will sporadically occur, situationally occur, but is not inevitable as a result of the premises that there is no governing superstructure in international relations. So I'll pause there and basically say that I've given a long-winded way of defining a difference between the offensive and defensive realists, which is that they agree that there is chaos in the world, but they don't agree that that chaos inevitably results in conflict. A piece of evidence from Stephen Lobel is not one that I will read back at you, but I think it's one of the best cards that I've seen at describing the difference between offensive and defensive realism. And I'll give you a moment to kind of look at that piece of evidence. And I think the most important thing that I want you to understand from that piece of evidence is that the defensive realists do think that war can happen, but they think it's more likely to happen from the arguments at the bottom of the card, as opposed to what the offensive realists might think, which is inevitable conflict over power. I'll pause for a moment, give you a chance to read that card, and I'll continue my pause to see if any of you want to use the chat bar or Tyler's email in order to send a question. We'll take a minute. I'll drink a little bit of Gatorade Zero. It's very healthy-ish. Any questions, Tyler, so far?
Nothing quite yet.
Mm-hmm.
Crushing it so far. So clear.
Lhasa in the house. Yow Yow in the house. I'm liking the nickname Yow2X.
So,
Yeah.
ooh, awesome. Okay. I just got a question. I'm guessing you're going to get here in a second. But the question was to sort of break down the difference between offensive realism and revisionism. Yeah, it's from Raoul.
Okay, so the question, in case you didn't hear Tyler, was to explain the difference between offensive realism and revisionism. I get really academic and wonky, but before I do, let me say that if you're defending a hard-line position in a debate, you're very frequently defending both the offensive realists and the revisionists. If I were asked on the SAT to write the difference between the two, here is what I would argue the difference is. The offensive realists are part of a broad school of thought, and they say, because there is no superstructure, conflicts are inevitable. Revisionism is an act by a country that is designed to revisit the broader world order. So one could say that the offensive realists claim that the United States and China will inevitably go to war because there is no structure that would stop them from doing so. But it is much more appropriate to argue that China is revisionist or that Russia is revisionist because they're not at the top of the mountain in the Lord of the Flies right now. Most people believe that the United States is a unipolar power, or if not the only power, the most powerful entity. So it would be odd to argue that the United States is revisionist, but it would make sense to argue that China or Russia is arguably revisionist in that they want to revisit and be aggressive in order to change the balance of power. And all of those assumptions rest on the assumption of offensive realism. Okay, so there's a question about, can you see the chat function?
I'm getting some of the questions. I don't see any new questions. So
okay, so I'm seeing a question that gets cut off a little bit, but it says, when you see, say the offensive realists have conflicts over power, is it specific to land or, and then the question sort of dies off. So no, the conflict could occur in any terrain. And as warfare changes and we move away from sort of bayonets and move towards wars that might take place in the realm of cyber or whatever else, then you're sort of seeing the offensive realists would say that any number of tactics could be used as part of inevitable conflict. So I'm glad we got a chance to read those cards. I'm going to revisit some of the terminology at the bottom of the Lobel card. But before I do, the last thing in that section says that there's a way number 3. And I think that this is really important to understanding the security critique and to debating it well. The security critique could argue that the offensive realists and the defensive realists are just straight wrong altogether. And that you could buy into a third school of thought called liberalism, which appears in the glossary. And the liberalists basically argue that there are some superstructures which do exist, entities like the United Nations, etc., that those temper the inevitable tensions which occur, and that all of the realists simply are flawed in their starting point, that there is as much chaos as the realists believe, and that even if there is chaos, the liberalists would believe there are things which temper that chaos, and they tend to be defenders of multilateralism, a 10-cent way of saying the United Nations and other international institutions. They tend to, secondly, be a fan of trade, which has its own set of baggage, but a lot of people would argue, for instance, that tension between the United States and China is lower than it might be in the realm of military and security policy because there is economic interdependent ties between the United States and China. And third, the liberalists tend to defend the growth of democracy and argue what is called DPT, or democratic peace theory. And so 3 of the sort of tenets of the liberalists are, there are other solutions to war besides inevitable power fighting, multilateralism, trade, and the idea of DPT, which is that democratic nations tend not to go to war, and that some of the most violent conflicts that we've seen over history, like World War II, are the result of the growth of non-democratic regimes, Hitler, Nazis, etc. I believe I'm getting a nonverbal cue from Tyler that I might be getting a question.
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of a hope to apply some of that discussion of revisionism and offensive realism to the appeasement dissent of this year's topic.
Yeah.
And to sort of provide a little insight on whether or not teams should frame those countries as revisionist or offensive realist, or if there's not a huge difference as long as they're making sort of a food score.
Okay, so depending on what area of the current arms sales topic that you're dealing with, there's a real argument to be said that there's an appeasement disad. And the appeasement disad, I think, would very logically say X or Y country, China stands out as an obvious example, is revisionist, okay? I don't know that you need to take a strong stance on realism, offense versus defense, but you could definitely defend the premise that China or Russia or whomever is revisionist, and that therefore anything which does not maintain the hard line against those entities, for the obvious example might be reducing arms sales to Taiwan, that would be exploited and utilized and seen as an opportunity for aggression by a revisionist power that would, like China in this example, and I'm not positing that I believe China to be a revisionist power, but that's the premise of the appeasement dissad, and that China would exploit weakness for their own gain, for their own aggression, etc. You could actually maybe defend that as a defensive realist proposition, arguing that war is not inevitable, but is the specific result of the United States not deterring through Taiwanese arms sales anymore. But I think that you do want to win, and arguably need to win, that X country is revisionist if you want to win the appeasement dissad. On the other hand, if you want to defeat the appeasement dissad, it is very, very valuable to come up with historical examples of how China or Russia or whomever is not revisionist. If you can spin that Russia or prove that Russia has not engaged in opportunism, you can pretty much win that appeasement wouldn't be a bad policy. Okay, so I'm seeing a question. If a nation is not revisionist, are the only options defensive realist or liberalist? No, and I don't want to be annoying as an instructor, but I'm going to get to that in a moment. And in later on in the notes, I talk about 7 different ways in which war occur. And I think that you shouldn't limit yourself to the realist, offense, defense, or the liberalists, because there's other schools of thought that can make your security critique better or your answers to the appeasement dissad better. So I love that question. So now on my notes, I'm kind of beginning to answer the question that Joanna put on the table, which is explanations for future wars. I'm going to use the very recent historical example of tension between the United States and Iran. And I know it wasn't a full-fledged war, but it got hot there for a second. And I'm going to use that to explain how you might contextualize tension between the United States and Iran in 7 different explanations. And if you're really thinking ahead, think of this as ways to make your security critique or ways to counter the security critique or the appeasement dissad by coming up with other explanations for why conflict might happen. So explanation number 1 is the offensive realist explanation. And I will contextualize that to recent events between the United States and Iran. The offensive realists would argue that there is no overarching structure that could regulate tension between the United States and Iran, and that therefore conflict between the United States and Iran is ultimately inevitable as they seek control. The offensive realist might take a longer lens of history and say, I don't want to go on predictit.com and say that there'll be a war by July, but I'll predict that there'll be one by 2030 because they believe that it is inevitable and nothing would prevent that tension. The defensive realists, in explanation number 2, would agree that there is no superstructure which exists and would say that therefore that makes tension possible. However, they would say that maybe the war is due to other explanations and that the war is not inevitable, and that therefore we should instead control the factors which do explain war and to not just assume that war will inevitably occur unless one side gets so much more power than the other that it deters or prevents it. So they could, for instance, say that the destruction of the Iran nuclear deal might be part of the reason that things got hot. They certainly could say that because there was a new president in the United States of America, that was a more sporadic and not inevitable variable. And they could even go further and say that because that president got rid of one security secretary of state and replaced them with a new secretary of state in Mike Pompeo, who has had a history of being more hawkish on Iran, that moved non-inevitable conflict into more inevitable conflict. So they agree that there is no overarching solution to the war, but they don't think it's inevitable, and they think little factors like the Pompeo dissad could better explain war from a defensive realist perspective than would the offensive realists. The security dilemma, I think, is a very different term of art, and it appears in the bottom of the label card, and it's a very good explanation for how things almost really got dangerous with Iran. You could argue that Trump does not like troops in the region and didn't really want a war for a lot of different reasons. One could also argue that the Iranians didn't really want war, okay? But some weird things happened. Iran shot down an American drone, which was a drone. It wasn't a human, which is more likely to solicit a stronger response. The Iranians angered the United States. There were protests in Iraq near the US Embassy there. And ultimately, the United States made an escalation and assassinated Soleimani. Then the Iranians, I think, lobbed weapons onto a Iraqi base, and they intentionally were trying to not kill Americans, that they had precision enough weapons that were designed to not kill Americans. But if they had accidentally killed an American, if one American was in a different part of the base, which is like totally possible, a lot of people argued that there was really nothing that Trump could have done in order to prevent the escalation chain from continuing. And so the security dilemma argues that even if both sides don't want war, that escalations occur because they're the inevitable result of a spiraling conflict that's difficult to control. This is an example of one way in which the defensive realists can believe that a war could occur, but could also be avoided. But a lot of times you can argue that wars just sort of get hotter than anyone anticipated. The defensive realists might be right, because the weapons that were lobbed by Iran into near US forces in Iraq did not result in greater escalation. And so maybe it was not the inevitable result of realist premises, but instead sort of got de-escalated through a wild sequence of events. The next explanation are domestic political factors. Here, the Iranians, in the example, had to respond once Soleimani, who was one of the most high-profile figures in all of Iran, once he was assassinated, they kind of were in no situation where they did nothing. There would be huge domestic political ramifications if they did nothing. Similarly, if an American soldier were killed in the bombing of bases in Iraq, it would have been very, very difficult politically for Trump, with an election coming up, to do nothing. And so some people argue that domestic political factors shape both directions. And by the way, domestic political factors arguably are tempering war in the Middle East, as Trump has, campaigned on the idea that he would not be involved in a whole bunch of wars throughout the world. Explanation number 5, I think, has already been put forth, which is a lack of democracy. Explanation number 6 is a lack of trade flows. There are examples which say that democratic countries or countries which trade with one another never go to war. There are counterexamples to both of those items as well. But arguably, in my opinion, and to maybe get to the thrust of how I would answer Joanna's question, I believe that the best explanation for security and the best answer to the security critique is that the world is complex, and that all of these explanations are possible, and that the world is contingent, which is a different way of sort of saying that there is no one uniform approach. And I could go to a class at Michigan State University about security and war, and I could say, maybe the fundamental problem with this class is that it's trying to come up with one explanation for international relations when there are thousands. And so contingency theory and complexity theory argues many things, but one of the things it argues in the context of the security critique is it's not cookie cutter, that there are a lot of reasons that wars occur. There's a lot of reasons that wars don't occur, that they're constantly changing, and that precise, specific evidence is the best way to predict whether or not an event will occur, and that we should not assume that the only item that we should draw upon are sort of these broader theories. So what is complexity or contingency? Well, I think I basically just explained it. And I'll use the example of Iran again, but in the context of North Korea. If the world were explained through one sequence of events, then the United States should have the same approach to Iran, who occasionally blusters and angers the United States, that it does to North Korea, who is forever trying to sort of stir up things with American allies in East and Northeast Asia. But the United States has a president that is very, very frustrated with Iran and kind of likes the leadership in North Korea. There's not really a lot of talk about the United States and North Korea getting involved in a hot war. And there's a lot of talk about the United States and Iran getting into it. So what explains that? Well, the explanation is because the world is contingent and there are different variables at play with North Korea than Iran. There are different political variables. If the president of the United States signed a peace deal with Iran, that wouldn't be a big political win because he campaigned on how bad a lot of peace deals were with Iran. Unless it occurred in a very different way and Iran gave up a lot, it would be prone to political questioning. But if the United States signed a peace deal with North Korea, that has been trumpeted by the president as a big deal. North Korea has nuclear weapons. Iran has not fully developed any nuclear arsenal. And so some people argue that we push around, the United States pushes around Iran, but doesn't push around North Korea because the ramifications could be different. The point isn't the difference between Iran and North Korea. The point is, if you're debating the security critique, make your opponent explain all of the differences in the world. Why are there war in some parts of the world? Why does the United States have certain tense relationships and other relationships that would seem to have the same premise but are not that tense? Explaining these differences cut apart cookie cutter explanations for why there's violence. And I'm not going to go through the Gavrov card, but it sort of explains how the Trump administration has different approaches to different parts of the world and isn't buying into any one understanding of the planet. So here is what I believe the ultimate affirmative approach should be against the security critique. And these are the questions that I would pose in order. I would sort of start off by saying, you, negative, have run the security critique against my war arguments. Which specific cards in the 1AC advance dubious understandings of security? I'll say that again. Question number one, which specific cards that we read in the 1AC advance dubious understandings of security? Secondly, are you claiming that all our affirmative cards defend a specific school of thought in international relations theory? Are you claiming that the piece of evidence that we read from Bandow defends a realist assumption? Are you saying it's offensive realism, defensive realism? Are you saying that we're defending liberalist assumptions? What are you saying that we're defending? Lastly, there have been wars and aggression throughout the world. How should we explain those outbreaks of violence? And that last question is really important because when the security critique is in a spot where it basically says, your war won't happen affirmative because wars don't happen, they struggle with history. And one of the brightest minds that I've ever seen on the critique is a guy named Brian McBride. And he always said that the critique struggled with empiricism, which is a 10-cent way of saying historical counterexamples are your friends. War and conflict does happen. It's bad, it's tragic, it is a social justice impact. And you need to be able to point to the moments of history which disprove their cookie cutter explanations of the way that the world works. And you need to get them to debate at a level of nuance where they're sort of explaining what's specifically wrong with your authors. And I think it's perfectly fine for an affirmative to say a war will break out with North Korea and a war will break out with Iran, and to give completely different explanations and simply say, the world is contingent, the world is complex. Security dynamics work differently in Asia than they do in the Mideast. That is a perfectly fine explanation that you should defend. You also should be very, very aggressive when you're affirmative at arguing that your opponent has not proven that your author is using the same kinds of international relations theory that the negative evidence is criticizing. I'll pause there and see if we have any new questions, Tyler. No new questions. Okay. A few tips for debating the security critique effectively, and I want to cover, so I'll be a little bit more concise here so I can talk about the new topic. Tip number one is to flip the sort of script on your opponent and ask, why do nations go to war? That's a really confounding question. And if they can't give an explanation as to why nations go to war, then, I think that that's a weakness for them. Make your impact D or your security critique specific. If you want to critique revisionism in China, that's a really effective critique against the premise of the appeasement dissad, if you're running a chaos, or against an impact module in the 1AC. And reading cards that China is not revisionist and that assumption is violent and it says something wrong about China, that's a really effective way to advance your critique that's much better than highly academic general cards about the security critique. It is fine to argue that war is not broken out yet, but when you're negative, don't just say, when is the war going to happen, but augment that with examples of when war has not happened under the school of thought that your opponent is defending. Lastly, when you're negative, try to come up with alternate explanations for why war does happen and try to have your dissat operate on those assumptions. You could defend offensive realism as a negative, run the appeasement dissat and say, war only happens as the result of appeasement. War will never happen because of the softer explanations that my affirmative opponent is giving. Okay, I'm going to transition quickly so I get in at least a little bit of time on the new high school topic. We do have one question, it seems.
Question
yeah.
About how to differentiate cross-sects or speeches that our authors, presuming you're the affirmative, who pose an aggressive version of Russia or China, don't support the specific version of IR theory that's being discussed. Presumably by the other team there. But if I missed the question,
okay, so it seems like the question, and you can always back channel us if we've gotten it wrong, and we can always respond by email because that's part of what we're doing. We're 21st century education here. It seems like the question is, can a negative that's running a revisionism appeasement dissad no link arguments that say offensive realism is wrong? Is that correct?
I think that's how I'm interpreting.
And I think they can. They can say that they are, and here's how. We are defending a defensive realist assumption, which applies to only a sporadic, not universal outbreak of violence, and that our defensive realist assumption is that this country needs to be deterred, but not that all countries need to be deterred, which would be more of the assumption of the offensive realists, if that makes sense. Or that this arms sale is particularly important to avoiding appeasement of this nation. So just make your argument an example of what the defensive realists are defending, which is that violence isn't always inevitable, but it might be inevitable in certain contingencies. And one of the contingencies is the lack of an arms sale might show a sign of weakness in current events. Okay. Anything else, Tyler?
Perfect.
So I'll be quick, but there's the wording of the new topic, and I'm going to run through this really quickly based on my color coding. Hopefully the color coding will come through on your end. So on the yellow section, I want to talk about the phrase criminal justice reform. Okay, so for those of you that are 2Ns, this is not the wording that you were hoping for. Criminal justice reform is bidirectional. And here's what I mean by that, okay? Most people believe in the literature that the phrase criminal justice reform means moving the politics to the left, that Kim Kardashian and Kanye West have the ear of Donald Trump, and they have pushed for shorter mandatory sentencing. They have pushed for a reduction in mass incarceration of non-dominant identities, okay? But that is not the only thing that criminal justice reform means. One could reform criminal justice and actually make the laws more strict and less in favor of the defendant. So one could reform criminal justice in the realm of sentencing and to make sentences harsher. And so that's a real frustrating component of the way that the topic is currently worded. It usually means softer, and I could see a T violation sort of being like, because it usually means softer, we're going to interpret that that would be better for the topic. And I haven't read every definition of the phrase criminal justice reform, but I would be hard pressed to vote negative on a criminal justice recommendation that made mandatory minimum sentencing stricter was not a reform of criminal justice, but we'll see. In the blue section, I want to talk about the United States federal government. Not that you already don't know what that means, but the United States federal government is sort of important because there's a big difference between federal crime and state crime. Most of your life, if you have an interaction with a police officer, it's very, very likely to be a state crime. When you get pulled over for speeding, it's incredibly unlikely that that would be the Federal Bureau of Investigation or someone how involved in the federal justice system. So it's important to know that most crime is defined by state governments, but there are a few things that are federal offenses. And because of the popularity that will inevitably exist under the state's counterplan, we're going to have a lot of discussion about federal law. So there are federal laws that relate to immigration. There are federal laws that relate to white-collar crime. There's federal laws that relate to corruption. And there's federal laws that relate to a wide variety of things. It's somewhat likely that the topic is going to zero in on some of the federal sentencing guidelines and federal policing, just because those are a little bit harder for the negative to counterplan out of and deal with. So learning the difference between what is and is not a federal crime is important. Of the three categories at the end of the topic, policing is the most state-oriented of those three things. There's clearly federal policing. I don't want to imply that ICE is not federal. It obviously is. The FBI is federal. It obviously is. There are federal attorneys. There are what are called U.S. attorneys that prosecute federal crimes. All of that is part of the game. But I do think the policing topic and some of what the people that wrote the topic were hoping to get at, which might be a discussion of how there are abusive police practices. The strongest affirmatives are going to need to differentiate between federal police officers and state officials. So the word enact in the green sentence has appeared in other topics in college and high school. And there is an argument, it's not ironclad, but there's an argument that enact means the Congress. It tends to be a word that applies to legislation. This is sort of very significant because many of the affirmatives would want to use the court system and the Supreme Court in particular for a federal affirmative, especially as it relates to forensic science and as it relates to sentencing guidelines, where the Supreme Court could really lay down big decisions that could make a difference for federal and state policy. And so I think that there will almost certainly be a summer camp T violation that the affirmative needs to be the Congress. And I'm not sure that enact so clearly means the Congress that the affirmative will lose on this T violation, but it's definitely something the negative is going to want to use to make the topic smaller and to not deal with tricky strategic court affirmatives. The thing that I want to spend a little bit more time on, at least as it relates to the new topic, is just discussing the three items in the purple section. And I'll be as concise as I can be. Forensic science, I think you maybe intuitively know what that is because you've seen CSI or one of its 11 spin-offs. I believe they're in New Orleans now. All right. But I do want to say that forensic science is a little bit more than just DNA and fingerprints. Forensic science is just the use of science as a standard to create more precise law enforcement. And so it can come up in the assessment of arson or firearms. It certainly obviously comes up in fingerprints or hair. And there is an argument, and I encourage you to read about it as you begin to think about the next topic, that a lot of faith has been put in forensic science, assuming that it never gets anything wrong. But there have been a recent wave of critiques which say that forensic science has been assumed to be 100% accurate and has been wrong. And so affirmatives might be interested in going down the path of reforming sort of the altar that forensic science is placed upon and requiring forensic science to have a higher degree of accuracy before someone is convicted of a crime. Policing is what you believe it to be. And I think I've already kind of explained what it is. I want to make a pitch for a specific article that I think would be of the highest use, which is there's an article that's relatively recent from the Washington Post, and it's called, I'll say this twice, How Policing Reform Can Actually Harm Black Americans. I'll say that again, how policing reform can actually harm Black Americans. There is this idea that if the affirmative were to reform policing, that intuitively that would be to the benefit of those that disparately experience the criminal justice system and sort of front-end policing. And there are some people that argue that that shift could be more counterproductive to those of non-dominant identities than the affirmative might believe. The examples in the article rest on facial recognition. So there's an argument that when the community police officer or a witness sees someone commit a crime, that they're likely to engage in like wildly inaccurate visual identification of someone who's a criminal, and that that criminal or suspect is disparately likely to be pinned as someone who is Black or brown or otherwise not of a dominant identity. And so there's been a push, and this article talks about it in an intriguing way, to move towards facial recognition, which is more objective and is arguably more likely to not make a mistake in the same way that visual identification does. But when you reform police departments to use facial recognition, there is an argument that you massively increase the amount of raw surveillance that's occurring, that you start to use ATM cameras and everyone's ring.com, et cetera, and that winds up sort of creating a new wave of over-policing, which is counterproductive for some of the very identities that police reform is designed to help and protect. And so that's a very intriguing example of how the policing portion of the topic could work out incorrectly. Lastly, I want to talk about sentencing. I think you intuitively know what sentencing is. It is the part of a criminal trial after a conviction has been secured where a judge determines, or a jury determines how long someone would either go to prison or what size of a fine they would occur in the enforcement stage. So it's when you move from conviction to the sentence. And there are federal sentencing guidelines which exist, and these used to require that a judge have what are called mandatory minimum sentencing. That if Tyler Thurr were to commit a federal crime for fraud, that he must serve X number of years in a federal prison. There was a famous Supreme Court case in 2006, you can use Wikipedia to look up the details, which said that the federal sentencing guidelines could no longer be mandatory in every situation because it discouraged the discretion of judges and the ability to look on a case-by-case basis. Some people argue that that's good, that discretion is good. We have all these examples of people who are doing 20 years for relatively minor offenses. Some people argue it's bad because discretion plays badly for certain people is disparately likely to play badly for certain identities, etc. And then reform is an interesting bidirectional phrase where you could increase mandatory minimums or you could reduce mandatory minimums, etc. The last thing I'll say about the topic is this. One thing that is academically intriguing about a criminal justice reform topic is that Jared Kushner is on the same page on criminal justice reform as Van Jones. If you don't know who those two people are, you can look them up. But Van Jones, pretty liberal, Jared Kushner, pretty conservative, and there's a weird opportunity for there to be some bipartisan agreement about certain criminal justice reform through establishment politics. Okay. I don't think there's any questions about the new portion of the topic. Is that correct, Tyler? Always feel free to email us at debate@msu.edu if you have any questions, or to contact me. It's 9 o'clock. I'll fulfill my promise. But before I leave, I just want to thank you all for spending an hour of your weekend with us. And I just continue to believe that we need to do more of these, and that this is pretty cool. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And we look forward to receiving any feedback from you as to whether or not you like this, or any questions that you have about what we said. Have a good evening, and thank you very much.